Ever feel like the Caribbean gets overlooked on the world stage?
Well, it shouldn't be, right?
Definitely not. I mean, it's at this fascinating crossroads with the U.S., China, Europe, all these big players.
Yeah, it's not just beaches and resorts.
Right. There's this whole geopolitical game going on. And that's what we're diving into today.
It's a deep dive, for sure.
Exactly. We want to make sense of it all. Why it matters, what choices these island nations are facing.
And they do have choices, which is interesting.
So first things first, we got to talk about the U.S., right?
The big guy in the neighborhood, historically speaking.
Yeah, huge influence. But it's not a simple story. The U.S. launched this thing called the Caribbean Basin Initiative back in the day.
Right. Aimed at boosting their economies.
On the surface, yeah, help them out. But some folks argue it kind of backfired, made them too reliant on U.S. markets.
I see where you're going with this.
Like what happens when the U.S. changes its policies? Suddenly, these Caribbean economies are left hanging.
Exactly. It's a vulnerability. Imagine you're a small island nation. Your whole economy depends on exporting, say, bananas to the U.S.
Okay, classic example.
Then bam, the U.S. slaps on some new tariffs or favors another banana producer.
You're in trouble.
Big trouble. And that's kind of what happened in some cases. It limited the Caribbean's options.
Could branch out, explore other markets.
Right, diversify. And it's not just about bananas, obviously. It's the whole principle.
Totally. And it gets even more complex when you bring in things like U.S. immigration policy.
Oh, yeah. Huge impact.
Think about the Caribbean diaspora. Families split between islands and the U.S. mainland. Remittances flowing back and forth.
Cultural exchange. Music, food, ideas constantly moving.
It creates these deep connections, but also tensions. It's not always a smooth ride.
No, definitely not. And it all ties into how the U.S. sees its role in the region, right?
Security, for example.
Yeah.
The U.S. is heavily involved in fighting drug trafficking in the Caribbean.
Makes sense geographically speaking. It's a major transit route.
Right. And they have all these defense collaborations, military exercises, that kind of thing.
Provide support, training, but it can also create this dependence, maybe.
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? Is it a true partnership, or does it create new vulnerabilities?
It's a balancing act for sure.
And then you've got China entering the scene.
Yes. The new kid on the block, but making waves.
Big time. Their involvement is way more recent than the U.S., but they're not messing around.
Especially with that Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah, the BRI, everyone's talking about it, but what does it actually mean for the Caribbean?
Well, think about it this way. China's pouring money into infrastructure projects all over the region.
We're talking ports, highways, even a whole cricket stadium, right?
Exactly. It's China's way of saying, hey, we're here to help. We're investing in your future.
But of course, there are always strings attached, right?
We're always strings attached. Some folks are worried about these projects leading to debt traps. Caribbean nations owing a lot of money to China.
Which could give China a lot of leverage, influence over their decisions.
Right. It raises concerns about sovereignty, independence. Can these countries stand up to China if they owe them billions?
So it's this whole dilemma. They need the investment, the infrastructure.
But at what cost? That's the question Caribbean leaders are grappling with.
And they're kind of stuck in the middle, right? Between the U.S., who's been there forever, and China, who's the new player with deep pockets.
It's a tough spot to be in.
And then we have Europe with its own unique history in the Caribbean.
Yes. The colonial past. Can't ignore that.
Definitely not. It hangs over everything. Trade agreements, cultural exchanges, even how people see each other.
It's like this unspoken tension sometimes. Europe trying to move beyond its colonial legacy.
But the Caribbean's still dealing with the consequences.
Absolutely. And then you throw Brexit into the mix.
Oh, man, what a curveball that was.
Especially for the Caribbean nations with strong ties to the UK.
Yeah, like those who were part of the Commonwealth. Suddenly, all these questions about trade deals, movement of people.
Yeah. It created a lot of uncertainty, anxiety, businesses worried about tariffs, families wondering about their right to live and work in the UK.
And it kind of highlighted this bigger issue of reparations, right?
Well, absolutely. That's a conversation that's gaining momentum.
The Caribbean saying, hey, you profited off our exploitation for centuries. We deserve acknowledgement and maybe some compensation.
It's not just about money, though. It's about addressing the systemic inequalities that colonialism created.
And those inequalities are still felt today in education, healthcare, economic opportunity.
It's a complex issue, for sure. Lots of different opinions on how to address it.
So looking ahead, what does all this mean for the future of Caribbean-EU relations?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a time of shifting alliances, changing power dynamics.
The old world order is kind of breaking down.
Exactly. And that could be an opportunity for the Caribbean. They're in this unique position.
They don't have to choose sides.
Right. They can leverage their relationships with all these major players, the US, China, Europe, to their advantage.
Forge a new path? Maybe.
Maybe. What if the Caribbean, instead of getting caught in the crossfire, became a model for a different kind of international relations?
One based on cooperation, mutual respect, equal partnerships.
It's a long shot, maybe, but it's a possibility, and that's what makes the Caribbean so fascinating to watch.
Totally agree. They're not just reacting to global events, they're actively shaping their own destiny.
Which means we should all be paying attention.
Absolutely. Because what happens in the Caribbean doesn't stay in the Caribbean.
It ripples out, affects us all.
So, yeah. Next time you hear about the Caribbean, don't just think beaches and sunshine.
Think geopolitics. Think potential. Think change.
Because the Caribbean is a region on the rise. And the world better take notice.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that about wraps it up for our deep dive today. Hope you learned something new and intriguing about this complex and fascinating region.
Always a pleasure to explore these topics with you.
Likewise. Until next time, keep those geopolitical gears turning.
And never underestimate the power of the Caribbean.
Exactly.
Exactly.